Okay, any questions before we start up again? I can see that everybody is enjoying the coursework and finds it very exciting. The coursework is challenging, it is. But sometimes, like I said, sometimes my answers are, hey, check out the screen capture demo I did on that, or hey, why aren't you following the debugging guidelines we talked about? That's very often my answer, right? So, and you might say, well, why are you telling us to watch these things? It's because they're very helpful for you in your coursework, right? It's like setting up Git in GitLab is kind of a pain. So that's why we created the screen capture demos. It's the same with the other things too, right? It's a little bit of a pain. There are lots of tools, lots of technologies here, so have a look at those. And I spend a long time working on those too. It doesn't look, you can't tell by looking at them, but I do spend time doing those. Okay, so let's talk about software licenses. We should be able to end early, and then I can answer some more questions after. Yeah. So there are different kinds of licenses. I don't know about all of the different licenses. I don't have them memorized. I have seen I know last year's test had a question on the licenses, by the way, the different types of licenses. So why would I want to have a license, or terms of developer use? You could call it terms of developer use. Imagine I publish somebody publishes some software, some disk optimization software, and then I use that disk optimization software and my hard drive and my computer explode. That's not a very likely scenario, but this is the kind of the license makes it such that it's kind of use at your own risk. Like if something goes drastically wrong, it's not my fault. It's not the person's fault who created the software. That's usually what the terms and conditions say in size 5 font. They usually say, like, if something goes wrong, you're not allowed to sue us. Right, you're liable if your laptop crashes or disk fails. Then it's your responsibility to make sure you have all your data backed up, for example. And you cannot sue us. This is a pretty common pattern, right? Has anybody heard of this pattern in another scenario before? I just learned about this recently. This is a very common pattern. Like, I'm going to offer you a service, but there's a special condition that if something goes wrong, you're not allowed to sue me. That's a very popular scenario. I also read about this in the healthcare system. This is a pub quiz. This could be a pub quiz question. So I read recently that in the NHS healthcare system, one of the reasons that it costs less per capita than the US is because you're not allowed to sue a doctor here. So if something goes wrong with your treatment or your prescription, you cannot sue the doctor. Whereas in the US, if something goes wrong, you can sue the doctor. But the consequence, that has financial consequences. And the financial consequences is that the health care costs more because the doctors need special insurance that they pay for in case a client sues them. Anybody else heard about that? I just learned that this year, actually. anyways, that's the idea behind one of the scenarios to avoid lawsuits. Another scenario is, imagine somebody writes a piece of open source software, then somebody else takes it and then they commercialize it and make millions of dollars or pounds or euros. Then should the person who developed the software in the first place benefit from that, for example, right? And that's the famous example is, Internet Explorer, but Internet Explorer was always free, right? Theoretically it was free, so it was not sold as a product. So the license is to cover different scenarios, right? To protect the person who developed the code, to protect future developers, and there are certain rules that sort of govern the use of these open source software bases, right? What can be done with the code? Can it be used for research purposes, educational purposes, or commercial purposes? Oftentimes the software, even closed source software, has a free use, free for students or research, non-profit organizations. Who's allowed to change it, who's allowed to distribute it, and any other kinds of information. So there are lots of different license kinds of open source software licenses. And they have different categories. One is called a permissive license. Subsequent users can produce closed source versions and sell the software. That's the Microsoft Explorer example, right? So they downloaded Mozilla, which is open source. Then they created a closed source product. So it's using the Mozilla web browser as an open source library, but the actual release of the Internet Explorer is closed source. So a permissive license agreement is allowing this kind of scenario. The copyleft license, any subsequent versions are left with the same rights. The source code must be supplied and can be modified. In other words, if you create a product from this open source software, the product you create has to be open source too. So you're passing the benefits on to the next generation of developers, let's say. That's called a copyleft license. So Apache has a permissive license. BSD, the distribution of Linux, has a permissive license, right? The GNU public license is a copyleft license, right? That's the Linux, for example. There's also the MIT license, which is a permissive license. Look, there's the Mozilla web browser. That's a funny example, actually, which is also a permissive license. Anyways, I don't have all of this stuff memorized. But these are just some examples, and of course the number of possible examples is very, very long. Okay, so what about you and developing your own open source software? You might want to develop your own open source code. I actually have done this before. When I was a master's student, I wrote a visualization program. The visualization program used an open source library, and I wanted to kind of give back, and so I published the source code to my master's thesis. I don't know if anybody actually used it, but I know that a lot of people looked at it at least. So what have we learned in DMS, in the DMS module? We have a lot more experience with Java. We have a lot more in-depth knowledge about object-oriented design. We use a lot of tools in this module, and the idea is to give you some practice working on larger projects, right, than the Hello World project. But you might want to create your own open source project. So if you were to create an open source project, there are some things you might want to think about. Identifying a need, right? Maybe you have an idea for an open source piece of software. The first thing you want to do, though, is to look for an existing solution, right? There's a good chance that somebody already has published a solution or a piece of open source software that addresses or fulfills your need or a need. So that's really step one. Step two, identify a need. Step two is see if anybody else has already published that idea or that software. Ask around, does it already exist, right? If the answer is no, or a lot of software is improvements to an existing program, right? There are some very famous examples of this too, right? The GitHub is an improvement over a previous version control system, right? A lot of the famous stuff is just improvements over previous systems. Facebook is an improvement over a previous system. Anybody? That's a pub quiz question. Anybody know what Facebook is an improvement over the previous version of Facebook? Name? Macquarie?
MySpace?
Yes, finally. Somebody knows some trivia, some geeky trivia. So I think 90%, I'm not exactly sure, but a very high percentage of the most popular software is an improvement over a previous system. So it doesn't actually have to be new. It just can be an improvement over a previous system. So code development starts, but notice the word finishes is not there, just starts. Create some sort of a website or a social media site and let everybody know. And then theoretically develop a community around that and then let the community add features, right, and find bugs and all that sort of thing. Of course, the difficult part is the funding, finding the time, finding the money, and so on. You can contribute to existing projects, right? There are lots of existing projects. Right on, this is a screenshot from GitHub. Does anybody know how many projects are on GitHub? That's a good place to search. Let's ask. Let's see what Google says. I have no idea. Is it in the millions? Oh wow. Okay, that's quite a lot. So, yeah, check for existing solutions before you start something new. The README files are also on GitHub, right? You can fork a project. And some projects will have a set of guidelines that they've written specifically on how to contribute, like bug fixes or feature requests and so on. Big projects usually have some sort of a chat forum or a mailing list, but some sort of a forum or a discourse where everybody can communicate, frequently asked questions, and some platform in which all the developers and users can communicate with. I can say that for like my master's thesis and PhD thesis, I relied very, very heavily on these development forums. I relied very heavily on open source software, and I relied very heavily on these forums because the developers for these libraries were distributed across Europe and North America, so the distances involved were very large. So I was often asking questions about different features of the libraries and different functions that weren't necessarily documented very well. And they pretty much saved me. I wouldn't have gotten through those projects without those discussion forums. Right, and contributing to an existing project, you can also judge the quality of an existing project just by the documentation. So a good project will have well-organized documentation, a well-organized forum, and it will be searchable, and it will be not too difficult to find the different information, right? The communication is usually very informal. I know that, like, for a lot of the libraries that I used as well, I never met the people that I was actually communicating with, unfortunately, which is, really not the greatest scenario. But I think today the most confusing thing is just the number of different possibilities there are for communicating. Since there are so many different possibilities, it can be a little bit, it's difficult to know which one is best, right? And they're always changing as well. Okay, so some of the challenges associated with open source software development. This is actually not just about open source software development. This is about every large team project, right? Trying to understand the whole system. Is there anybody that actually understands the whole system? Well, not really. Generally, the answer is no. Nobody understands the whole system. And that's actually a good thing. I mean, that's if you're following good object-oriented design principles, you're using encapsulation, and encapsulation enforces information hiding, and therefore we don't have to know about the whole system. Nobody has to know about the whole system. A single object should not have to know about all the other objects, and it's the same with the software, right? Coming up with ways to incorporate the requirements of non-developer users or just end users, let's say. There are software change requests software that will handle things like that, but that change request software can be very problematic, actually. The larger the number of developers there are, the more complicated this coordination will be. The coding conventions, by the way, are especially important when you're working in a team, right? If the team is not following some coding conventions, then you're in big trouble. Like, that project is in big trouble, right? And the same with the object-oriented design principles. If the object-oriented design principles are not being followed, then your project is in big trouble. And I'm actually going to have a fun lecture on this topic. So I was going to talk about some of the consequences of the things that go wrong when you don't follow some of these rules and some of these coding conventions and some of these object-oriented design principles from my own experience in as a commercial software developer. Right, because I've had commercial software development jobs before. Okay, so there's lots of resources on open source software and contributing to different projects and starting your own project. Are there any questions or comments? Okay, we will finish early then. If people are happy though. If you're happy to finish early, we can finish early. But if you're unhappy, we don't have to finish early. Name? Dash.
I just wanted to ask, what's to stop someone from violating a license, or how do you enforce licenses?
That's a very good question. Dash asked, how do you enforce the licenses? There is no, you may have noticed this already, there is no software license police. So it's very difficult to enforce these licenses. The time when the licenses become very important is in the commercial setting, when somebody is making lots of money from maybe a third open source library. But it's only like these typical scenarios will have to be resolved often in a court system of court, like where you actually file a lawsuit and you say, it's a tricky business, there's no question about it. But you want to find some evidence that somebody is profiting from your open source software or your software. That's challenging in itself to prove or gather evidence that somebody is selling a commercial product and not, paying the benefits that they were supposed to in the terms of the license agreement. A kind of sneakier way might be to have some functionality in the software itself that sends some reporting information, so I can actually query the software and like an Easter egg kind of query that says, okay, if I can download this software and hit like Control-Shift-FTR, and then a screen pops up, that's evidence that they've used my software, right? That's a magic key combination, Easter egg combination that proves that they've using my software. But to enforce it, it's really the court system, unfortunately, that has to enforce these kinds of things. You have to sue. You might have to sue somebody. Yeah. Good question. I'm not an expert on law enforcement and the rule enforcement. Any other questions? Okay, if everybody is happy, we'll stop early.